Called Todd Muller.
Mr Speaker, thank you. Well, this is very exciting to be able to stand and speak to the Wellington Town Belt Protection Bill. Bit of a red letter day, as Honourable Member mentioned before. A couple of reasons for me. Firstly, I think this may well be, in my political career, maybe the only time I stand shoulder to shoulder on a bill with a man who I used to be a student union president with. So acknowledge you, Grant, and possibly one or two times it may be. I acknowledge you and your commitment to this, and also acknowledge the friends of the Wellington Town Belt. It's great to see that you're here and seeing the fruits of your collective effort coming in front of us today. And secondly, it's good to be talking something other than avocados, though I'm sure it was a very enjoyable conversation earlier. And thirdly, Mr Speaker, I am someone who's passionate about history and actually passionate about wide open spaces. So here's a convergence here for me of two things which I'm actually quite interested in. And I am seriously interested in this. If you go to Hagley Park in Christchurch, or if you go to Mangakaiki, Cornwall Park, One Tree Hill, you see examples of our forefathers' vision in terms of how do we create the best place for people to live, and getting that convergence, if you like, between places for us to live, work and play. I'm sure they used different terminologies back then, Mr Speaker, but Wellington Town Belt is very much in that same tradition, Mr Speaker, with the vision of those all those years ago holding a view of around what this great city could look like into the future. So as we've heard already this afternoon, Mr Speaker, those visionaries in 1839 drafted the initial settlement plan for Port Nicholson, which is an interesting name. Perhaps they could have stayed with it. Sounds slightly more romantic than Wellington, but anyway, it did change over time, and of course it is now Wellington City, but that initial plan to have Town Belt hectareage as public property on condition that no buildings can ever be erected on it. And this was visionary in its time. And if you think back to 1839 in England, which, you know, most of, if not all of our directions came back then, the idea of a town belt was a novelty. There were parklands in Britain, yes, but they were where the wealthy went to cavort on a Saturday, Sunday afternoon. But those who lived in the more intense industrial areas of town, they had no places. And so this vision of actually creating some green space where people could go, regardless of socio-economic status, and actually enjoy space, they were called the lungs of a city. And that was the vision that informed the New Zealand Settlement Company all those years ago, and it's what we are talking about here to ensure that we enshrine it in legislation that is relevant and effective for 2015, but it stays true to that initial vision, Mr Speaker. And that initial settlement deed, as we hear, by 1873 was passed over at 1,061 acres. I need to get this right, Mr Robertson, so it's on record that I'm endorsing and supporting you on this issue only. One road, 1,061 acres, one rood and two perches. I think I've got that right, was granted to the city in 1873 as a public recreation ground, Mr Speaker. And now, of course, the town belt is 400 hectares and it stretches from Mount Victoria to Te Ahumairangi Hill. But of course that deed, when established in 1873, providing the council with its authority to hold and manage the Wellington Town Belt, enabled it to have, obviously had certain rules and regulations to underpin it. But what we have found through this process, and obviously we will talk through more specifically when we are in Select Committee, is that the Old Town Belt was difficult to interpret. Obviously a range of statutes which now are not aligned with other particular bills and acts that we need to obviously get some congruence around. In particular, Mr Speaker, this bill will provide certainty because it becomes the principal source of the Council's powers for protecting, managing and enhancing the Wellington Town Belt. The bill's in 4 parts. No doubt we'll have time to talk about that in future, Mr Speaker, but I am pleased to see that in Part 2, not only is the powers listed there, but also the responsibilities that lie on the Council with respect to being very overt within a management plan that will of course get discussed regularly. I'd love to carry on, Mr Speaker, but I shall now sit down and look forward to the Select Committee discussions.